Well, there is a lot happening in the world, a lot sobering that is happening in the world. And one thing about this course is that everything that is happening in the world is both affected by and you will see reflected in what we talk about in this course. For example, today, the Labor Department, Bureau of Labor Statistics, came out with their monthly jobs report. You probably saw it. It showed a huge increase in the number of jobs for the month of February, and that's great. But it also showed no increase in wages. The median wage, the typical wage, went up 1 cent in February. Now, anybody who's been paying attention to what's happening in the economy knows that inflation is increasing by an annualized rate of 7.5%, which means that a 1 penny increase in wages actually means a wage drop for the typical American. Now, what's the connection to what's happening in Ukraine? The connection is that the next sanctions that Europe, particularly Europe and the United States, have in their artillery of sanctions against Russia is oil and gas. Sanctioning Ukraine, Russia's exports of oil and gas. But what does that mean? That means that gas at the pump and heating oil that a lot of people depend on, those prices are going to soar. Now, what does that mean if your income is dropping? Well, that's a rhetorical question. Everything almost is related to almost everything else. One other thing we've seen in this course, and we saw it particularly last week, is that the old mythology, the old fiction that it's a choice between market and government, doesn't really work because you can't have a market without rules. And those rules come in the form of laws and regulations that are made by people, by legislators, by administrators and administrative agencies, by courts, by judges. And the real question is not the choice between government and market. The real choice is, and the real issue is, who has the most influence over making those rules, those laws, those regulations. Oh, it's such a pleasure to see your faces as I say all these things. You have no idea how depressing it is to look at my computer week after week. We are going to start the second half of the course now. And the second half of the course really does get into policies, policy areas. But it's very important that you understand, that I know that you know that I know, that in the first half of the course we ended with a very big question. And that very big question was the same question asked by the famous jurist Louis Brandeis in the form of a choice. He said, America has a choice. We can either have great wealth in the hands of a few, or we can have a democracy. But we can't have both. And what he meant by that, I believe, he said it in the first Gilded Age. We're now in what might be called the second Gilded Age of great wealth in the hands of a few. What he meant is that no matter what public policies you might want to create to stop the influence of great wealth, it is very difficult to do that. Partly because of the chicken and egg problem, because great wealth is going to stop those policies, but partly because great wealth will find ways of influencing public opinion and politics, notwithstanding whatever you put in the way. Now, I have made it a point in this course, and I will continue to make it a point, not to try to tell you what to think. I want to give you frameworks. I want to give you facts. I want to give you data. But I also want to give you a way of thinking about challenges. We're going to be talking about remedies, and obviously the first remedy, quote unquote, or policy to deal with widening inequality of income and wealth and racial inequality would be to utterly simplify, to take money from the wealthy or to tax the wealthy and to redistribute it to everybody else. I mean, that's in very simplistic, utilitarian grounds. That would simply be one way of doing it. That is, $1,000 to Warren Buffett or to Jeff Bezos is not even recognizable. They don't even deal in thousands of dollars, but $1,000 that goes to somebody who's poor is a huge deal. So in utilitarian fashion, there is an argument for redistribution. Redistribution. People don't want to talk about it in those terms because it's politically incorrect, but that's really where we're beginning. We're going to look at the pitfalls. It's not that simple. It's much more complicated. Maybe it's not appropriate to redistribute. Today's outline, we're going to be looking at redistribution through government taxing and spending. Okay, progressive and regressive policies. I want to explain those to you, because that's a big, big theme today. What's a progressive, what's regressive? It's not about progressive politics. We're going to look at progressive and regressivity in terms of policies. Next, should the rich pay more income taxes, or should they pay a higher rate of income tax? Some of you might say yes, but it's more complicated than that. Again, one of the purposes of this course is to get you to think more deeply. I don't want to change your mind about anything. I just want you to think harder. Number 3, payroll taxes. What are they? Why should we even be concerned about payroll taxes? You may not even worry about them. Next, state taxes, sin taxes, sales taxes, user fees. And then number 5, wealth taxes. What are wealth taxes? Why should we even consider wealth taxes? Number 6, corporate taxes. And number 7, tax expenditures. Now, I'm not sure we're going to get through all of this, but here's what I want to tell you. This, among all of our classes, is the most complicated and difficult to actually attend to in terms of attention. So in some ways it's great that we're all together. In other ways it's sort of ironic that this is our first in-person class. But I want to urge you to try, because these are really important issues. They are undergirding almost everything else. And then, oh yes, pre-distribution. I just want to make sure you remember from the last class. When, by minute, the market actually is effectively distributing to people in terms of who gets what. And we saw that in a variety of ways. Okay, the distribution of income and wealth resulting from how the market is organized. The corporation, remember, we remember going ancient history, we did that shareholder versus stakeholder, and then the sorting mechanism, that is, who's actually paying for resources in terms of pooled resources with others. And then we looked at racial and ethnic discrimination, we looked at bargaining power, monopoly versus union, and property contract default. That is, if you can't pay an enforcement. I just want to say to you, these are all ways that governments organize markets. And they're all based on decisions. They are all political. And by political, I mean that somebody has to make the decision. And they make the decision on the basis of, very often, who is applying what kind of pressure. Some of that pressure might be intellectual and policy-oriented. Very often it's not. Which gets us to redistribution. Now, pre-distribution, again, is how the market is essentially distributing money, goods, services, resources. But then we come to the redistribution. After the market is doing all of this, government efforts to redistribute income and wealth outside of the market, taxing those with higher incomes and wealth, and using tax revenue to benefit those with lower incomes and wealth. That is the essence, the simplistic essence of redistribution. But what is there to know, essentially, and to keep our eyes on this business of progressive versus regressive? And maybe the way into it, the easiest way into it, I don't know if you, well, we'll see. We'll do a clicker exercise, a kind of vote exercise. Okay, what should be free? Number A is, in your view, this is just your view. A, K through 12 education, highways, parks, libraries, public safety, and clean air. B would be A plus safe drinking water and childcare. And C would be A and B plus higher education, early childhood education, public transportation. And then D would be A, B, and C plus healthcare, minimally adequate nutrition, minimally adequate shelter, basic subsistence income. What do you think? Go. Okay, we have 426, 434, 449. We're going up. Come on, let's get to 500. We can do it. 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 We're almost there. 493, 494, 497, 498, 499, and great. Okay, now let's see what you think. Well, 70% of you think D, A plus B plus C plus etc. What do you expect? It's Berkeley, right? Well, I understand, and I certainly respect your decision, but as the economist Milton Friedman once said, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So somebody has to pay, and the question here is who pays? Okay, what does free mean? A, taxpayers pay the cost, or B, corporations pay the cost, or C, consumers and users pay. What do you think free means? Go. So most of you, that is 75% of you, say taxpayers should pay, but there are a number of you that say free means corporations should pay the cost, and then there's about 9%, 47 of you say consumers and users should pay. The reason this is an important question, obviously, is not only is there no free lunch, but there's no free anything. And who is going to bear the bill, even among taxpayers? Even among taxpayers is an interesting question. Because not all taxpayers are equal. It only really works as a redistribution if the tax system is progressive. Now, a progressive tax means that a larger percentage of one's income, if we're talking about an income tax, larger percentage of tax rate, a higher tax rate, it goes from those with higher incomes. And the principle here is a principle that Adam Smith, the 18th century economist, was very explicit about. He said that fairness requires a progressive, he didn't use the term progressive, but he said fairness requires a system in which there's equal pain, equal sacrifice. Equal sacrifice means not the same percentage from everybody, because if somebody is extraordinarily wealthy, 10% of their income or wealth, or whatever you want to call it, that you're taking 10% of, is not nearly as much sacrifice as 10% of somebody who's poor. 10% of somebody who's poor is a huge deal. 10% of somebody who's very wealthy may not be as much of a sacrifice in terms of actually pain. So that's why in Adam Smith's world, and it was taken up by the United States in the first income tax in 1913, that's why the notion that we should have a progressive income tax was born. You want higher rates for higher incomes. Principle of equal pain or equal sacrifice. A regressive tax is that an equal or larger percentage is taken, that is the same or lower tax rate, from lower income. That would generate, in Adam Smith's terms, larger pain, larger sacrifice for those at the bottom. But that doesn't end. I mean, even if you decide you wanted to have a progressive tax, you also have to look at the spending side. Now, the exercise we did before in terms of what you wanted, A, B, C, D, in terms of more and more public benefits, let's assume that that's the proper word, that doesn't really tell you necessarily how government is going to spend tax revenues. I mean, it could spend tax revenues on a new sports stadium, but the sports stadium could have so many amenities for very wealthy people that it's really not accessible to poor people or lower middle class people. Or you could have a new art museum. I love art. In college, nobody knows this until and keep it in this room, will you please? I majored, when I was an undergraduate, in art history. I love art history. And see where art history got me? But what I meant to say is a new art museum, even though I love art history and I love art museums tend to cater to people who are higher income. So if you take tax dollars and put them into art museums, you're not necessarily making progressive spending decisions. The same thing with a new ballet or a new symphony hall or, infrastructure. The question is roads or public transit. If you put the money into public transit, that's more progressive. If you put it into roads, that's somewhat less progressive, somewhat more regressive. Or if you look at education, do you do pre-K or K through 12 or public university? We all would say public university, but public university is slightly more regressive, less progressive than K through 12. Are you with me? Or Medicare or Medicaid. We're going to come to Medicare, Medicaid. Medicare in 1965, it was and is a system of assistance, health care, guaranteed health care for people over 65. It was 1965, and it's over 65, but its poor cousin is called Medicaid. And Medicaid is for poor people or lower income people. Medicaid, when I say its poor cousin, I mean quite literally, but also politically. Medicaid is subject to all sorts of constraints and political gamesmanship, and expansion at the federal level often doesn't really kind of extend itself to expansion at the state level if the state doesn't like Medicaid or doesn't like government. Corporate subsidies. We have subsidies for agribusiness, for oil and for gas, for pharmaceuticals. Those corporate subsidies are not exactly progressive use of tax dollars. My only point is that it's not adequate, sufficient to just look at progressive taxes. You have to also look at the spending side. Now, government taxing and spending, overall, if you compare what would have happened to people if we didn't have taxes and redistribution, transfer payments they're called, relative to what would have happened without them, you can see here, we're starting in 1974, and going through 2016, the latest data we have, and we're looking at subtracting taxes and then adding back the benefits of Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, infrastructure, defense, education, everything government does, but we're looking at the total effects of government spending on lower income people relative to taxes. And what you can see here is that the bottom 50% before taxes and transfers by 2016, and you can bet it probably continues out here, would have been around the same as they were in 1974. That is, hovering close to $15,000, but they are doing much better after taxes and after transfers, after redistribution. Right now, they're up to about $25,045. So on net, taxing and transfers, redistributions, are working to the advantage of lower income people. Should the rich pay a higher tax rate? Well, if you really do believe in the Adam Smith notion of progressive taxation, equal pain, then you might say yes, but wait a minute. Wait a minute. Just hold your horses. Because you might say to yourself, no, it's unfair. I mean, the rich, that is people who have over $200,000 in income, let's just arbitrarily say, and they are pretty rich per year, they already provide half of all federal income tax revenue. And we're going to look here in this chart, we're going to look, this is who is providing what percentage of revenue. And this is going to be percentage of income taxes paid to the federal government. So this is the one to watch, this column. And what I want you to see is that in terms of the percentage of returns filed, these groups, over $200,000, they don't make up much of the population. A very, very small group of the population, but look over here at the percentage of income they pay. Well, it's over half already. And you want to tax them more? Really? I mean, here's another reason why you may not want to tax them more. You know, if you try to tax them more, they will have fewer incentives to invest and to create jobs. And by the way, inevitably, they will find ways to avoid paying them, using accounting gimmicks, foreign tax shelters, moving to another nation, right? I mean, one of the great sages of modern America, the sage is Lawrence Summers. He's an economist, Treasury Secretary under Obama. And he said that Clinton and Obama would have been against a much higher tax rate on the wealthy because we would never have a Steve Jobs or a Jeff Bezos or any of the other inventors. It's better to have inventors and having all that innovation than just have tax revenue. I last debated Larry Summers in September, and I get a great satisfaction from debating Larry Summers. But here it comes to you. Should the rich pay a higher tax rate? Yes or no? Go. So 88 or 89% of you think the rich, even after I made such a compelling case, I've got to do better. All right, well, let's explore this further. Now, you remember the suspension bridge that we talked about in terms of what happened over the last century to income as a percentage of total income, the top 10%. Now, pre-tax income inequality has returned to Gilded Age levels. This is top 1% single earner income starts now at $357,552. And you can see that this is, you know, when I say we're returning to Gilded Age number 2, this is Gilded Age 2. This is where we are right now, second Gilded Age. This is where we were when Louis Brandeis said we can have a choice between great income at the top, great concentration of income at the top, or a democracy, and this is where we are right now. This is the top 1% after taxes. This is the top 1% pre-tax. I mean, after taxes, yes, it takes some bite, but not a huge bite. So a 50% marginal tax rate on incomes over $360,000, which is basically what we were just talking about, the top 1%. Well, I want you to calculate this. Now, we're not going to do this fast, but I'm giving you 3 options here. Someone with an income of top 1% would pay a marginal income tax rate, 50% on incomes over $360,000. It would be A, $181,000, B, $88,000, or C, $1,000. Go. Well, you don't have an overwhelming view, I guess. You know, about 36% of you think it's A, and then 36% of you think it's B. It's C. Now, let me explain why it's C. It is C because we're talking about a 50% marginal tax rate on incomes over $360,000. So if you have an income of $362,000, you are being taxed on $2,000. The marginal tax rate refers to the maximum over which the tax begins to operate, what that threshold is. Now, there's a lot of confusion in the public about this because every time politicians in Washington, or even at the state level, start talking about raising taxes, they never talk about this. They talk about raising taxes to X percentage. And so everybody thinks, oh, well, my taxes are going to go up. But it's important that people understand this. We're only talking about the marginal tax. We're only talking about over a certain threshold. Pay attention to that threshold. There is so much mythology in this area, and so much mythology that's being exploited every day. By the way, what is, now, when I say today's lowest tax rate, I'm talking about the lowest tax rate on incomes. Is it A, 0% from zero income to $9,875, or is it B, 5%, or is it 10% on the lowest incomes? What do you think? Go. A lot of you think that it's 0, and a lot of you, well, you know, we got about 47% 0, and then 30%, if I can read it correctly, say 5%, and then 110 of you, 22% say 10%. It's actually C. So bear in mind that when we're talking about the progressivity of the tax code, it is reasonably progressive, but not nearly as progressive as you might think. I mean, take a look at this, for example. If you look at the marginal tax rate, here's the highest, starting in 1913, when Congress put it into effect. On the highest income, the highest marginal tax rate, look at this, in the 1950s, under President Eisenhower, a Republican president, the highest marginal tax rate was about 93%. Now, that's not entirely correct, because after deductions and tax credits, the effective rate was below that, but this was the official marginal tax rate. And then look what's happened. Meanwhile, the lowest tax rate, the difference between the highest and lowest tax rate has decreased substantially. over the years. And you ought to be asking yourself, based upon our classes, based upon our discussions so far, why is this happening? Especially at a time when we're in the second Gilded Age, especially when more and more income and wealth is going to the top. Why? Why? Well, you know. Because we talked about it last week. Now, before I show you this graph, I just want to talk for a moment about the effective tax rate. You're going to hear this term bandied about. What effective tax rate means is that after you make the deductions and also figure in tax credits, and we'll talk about that in a minute. These are incredibly important. You need to understand this. After you figure in all deductions and tax credits, what is the tax that's left? What's the actual effective tax that's being paid? And what I want to show you here is that if you combine, and this graph combines federal taxes and state taxes, which we'll talk about in a moment, and local taxes. So this graph, this shows the lower income and higher income, and you're going to see in this, it's a kind of animated graph, you're going to see what has happened over the years to the distribution of taxes, that is the progressivity of taxes, total taxes, federal, state, and local. Okay, ready? Go. I mean, not you, go. That's 1950. 1967, 68, 72, 76, 78, 80, 85, 90, and we're going down to 90, and we're getting to 2000. Did you notice? Let's do it again. Okay, this is in 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and we have to stop at 2018 because we don't have data beyond 2018, but the shape of this line is the top 400, the richest 400 people. The big change has been in terms of the effective, what's actually paid. Do you want to see this again? I love this tax. I love this graph. I love graphs. Okay, let's do this once more time. Okay, one more time. Look at that. It should be musical. It should have a background. It has a kind of a rhythm to it, doesn't it? Now, I was born in 1946. Do you know who else was born in 1946? Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Donald Trump. Anybody who is anybody was born in 1946. Oh, do you know who else was born in 1946? The person who I, before I die, want to meet. Dolly Parton. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I was thinking about her, and I tweeted. I said, Dolly Parton and I want to meet her. I want to meet her because we're the same height. We have the same political values, but she's a better singer. And she never got in touch with me. If anybody here knows Dolly Parton, will you please let her know? I don't even have to go on a date with her like I did with Hillary. Okay, I want to show you the effective, that is the actual, after deductions, after tax credits, effective tax that the typical worker in the United States is paying relative to the average of rich countries. This is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So you can see here, here's the United States. So we're not paying the average, the typical American is not paying much in taxes, but the other side of that coin is the typical American is not getting back health care or free higher education or a lot of other benefits that go with paying higher taxes in a lot of these other countries. Which gets us to the payroll tax. How many of you, I'm sure most of you have had jobs, right? And you've got payroll stubs, or you've got, something that says FICA. Ever got FICA? You know what FICA is? Money is taken out of your paychecks for FICA. Do you know what FICA is? Did you think that money just went to FICA? Just goes to FICA. Well, FICA stands for the Federal Insurance Contributions Act, and that's Social Security and Medicare. That's what you're paying into. That little thing on your pay stub that says FICA, that is your contribution to Social Security, and it's called the payroll tax. FICA, yes, it's the Federal Insurance Contribution Act, but what it really, in common parlance, it's called the payroll tax. And everybody is supposed to pay it, and it's withheld from your paycheck. But you need to know a little bit more about it, because it figures it's a big part of our story about progressivity and regressivity. A payroll tax is a tax on employers' entire payroll, A, or B, a tax on an employee's total wages and benefits to pay for Social Security and Medicare, or C, it's a tax on an employee's wages to pay for Social Security and Medicare, or it's a D, a tax on an employee's wages to pay for schools, roads, and other services. Go. You're not sure. About 45% of you say it's C, a tax on an employee's wages to pay for Social Security and Medicare. Well, that's what I pointed out, and yes, you're right, but it's not quite right. That is, B would be a little bit more accurate, and it's C, it's certainly not D. But here's the thing you need to understand. Employers pay the other half. The way, I used to be a trustee of something called the Social Security Trust Fund. Have any of you heard political people or even policy analysts say Social Security is running out of money? Have you heard that? There won't be enough money left for you by the time you retire. Have you heard that? That's BS. I was a trustee of the Social Security Trust Fund. What does that mean? I would get together 3 times a year with this group of actuaries, these accountants, whose job it is to look at the Social Security Trust Fund, see how much money there is, and they would make projections. When is Social Security going to, quote, run out of money? Well, I remember the first time I met with this group, they projected 23 or 24 years, and I said, well, wait a minute. What do you mean running out of money? What happens when it runs out of money? Do you mean people who have paid into Social Security don't get Social Security back? And they said, oh, no. It has nothing to do, it's not like that. It just means that the account called the Social Security Trust Fund is depleted. Well, I remember saying, well, but if it's depleted, doesn't that mean that there's no money left? And they said, no. And they laughed. They laughed. I was mortified. They laughed. And I said, well, what does it mean to be depleted. And then they gave me a little lecture, and I'm going to boil down the lecture they gave me so you know the reality. The reality is that when you pay in FICA to Social Security, you have a Social Security number. Most of you have a Social Security number, right? You think there's an account that you're paying into. There's no account that you're paying into. You're not paying into anything having to do with you getting anything back from that account. Social Security money paid into FICA goes into the general account, federal revenue. It goes into the same big basket, the same big pot that all other federal taxes go into. So you're paying for defense. You're paying for corporate subsidies for big oil. You're paying for everything else the federal government does. It's the same bag of money. It's the same big pot, but it's labeled as an accounting measure. It's labeled Social Security. But when that pot of Social Security runs out, it just means the federal government will start paying you from every other source of revenue. It's an obligation of the federal government, and it's a pay-as-you-go system. There's no money for you. That is, my generation, I've been paying into Social Security for 150 years. Well, where is that money? Am I going to get that money back? No, I'm going to get money that you pay in. It's a pay-as-you-go system. Why? You know, when Franklin D. Roosevelt came up with this system, and his Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, who you already have met, right? We've talked about Frances Perkins, haven't we? When she designed Social Security and Franklin D. Roosevelt came up with the details, somebody in the cabinet, when they went over this in a cabinet meeting in 1935, somebody said, well, wait a minute, you mean it's pay-as-you-go? I mean, people will think that they're paying in, but they're not paying in? And they think that they have their individual accounts, and they're not, and they don't have individual accounts? Why are we doing it? It's such a complicated thing. Why are we doing it this way? And Franklin D. Roosevelt looked around his cabinet table, and he said, we're doing it this way. Now, you have to excuse the language I'm about to use, because this was Franklin D. Roosevelt, not me. Franklin D. Roosevelt said, we're doing it so those sons of bitches on the Hill cannot ever destroy this program. If people think that they have paid in to their own accounts, it will be permanent. And of course, he was right. But it's also the most popular program government ever invented. It will never run out of money. It's an obligation of the United States government to pay your Social Security. Employers pay half of it, for a total of 15.3%. Now, many people, economists, understand that the wage that employers pay you is usually the minimum that employers can pay to get your services. But it's also the maximum that they need to pay to get your services. Do you understand that? So if employers were not paying their half of Social Security, presumably their half would be going to you in your paychecks, which means you, as a worker, are actually paying 15.3% of your wages. This is another mythology, that employers pick up half. No. The cap on incomes subject to Social Security taxes. Now, why is this important? Are we getting into the weeds here? No. Well, we are, but this is important weeds. Why are we looking at this? Because a lot of people think, just like the marginal income tax, this is sort of another example. They think that Social Security, everybody pays Social Security. What is the cap on income subject to Social Security? What do you think? Go. Okay, what do you think? Let's see what you think. Well, you're not sure. Most of you say the cap is $637,700, which you are interpreting correctly as, anything above that is not subject to Social Security taxes. But the reality is, it's D. In other words, any income up to $142,800 this year, now it's adjusted for inflation every year, but for this tax year, and the taxes are due pretty soon, but this is Social Security, so you've been paying it as withholding. But it is now $142,800. Up into $142,800, you are paying full Social Security, Medicare, payroll taxes. Above that threshold, you are paying nothing. In other words, Jeff Bezos fulfills his obligations to pay Social Security taxes at approximately 3 minutes past midnight, January 1st of each year. This, my friends, is a regressive system. Again, nobody knows it. I mean, how many times have you sat down with your parents or your uncles and aunts or anybody else and said, Social Security, yes, it's regressive. You don't have those kind of conversations. Well, I want you to. Because they're important. It's important. People don't get it. They don't understand it. The payroll tax is regressive. The income tax is progressive. Take a look at this. Now, down here, are people who are lower income. This is less than 10,000, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40. And what you see here is the payroll tax is taking a big chunk. And the payroll tax takes a less and less and less and less and less and less chunk. Here, we're at $1 million and over. The concept of equal pain, equal sacrifice, is not achieved in the payroll tax. In fact, if you really think about it, people who are higher income, generally speaking, live longer. So they're collecting Social Security for many more years than lower income people who die earlier. We're going to get into this in a few weeks, which makes it even more regressive. But here is the irony. The payroll tax is a growing part of federal revenue. Remember I said it all goes into the same pot? It does go into the same pot. Let's take a look. Starting in 1935 and all the way up to, it's actually right about now where we are, you can see that payroll taxes used to not really account for all that much. Corporate income taxes, individual income taxes. Individual income taxes basically have accounted for about the same share of total federal revenue over time, starting after the Second World War. Corporate income taxes have dropped dramatically. The payroll tax continues to increase as a share of total federal tax revenue. Or to state a different way, this is a tax on corporate income. This is a tax on wages. Tax on corporate income keeps on dropping as a percentage of total tax revenue. Taxes on wages keep on increasing. This is a regressive tax. So here's another debate I often have, where my debate partner or somebody who's opposing me says, well, the income tax is progressive and it also takes a huge bite out of the incomes of people at the top. And so what are you talking about in terms of raising taxes? And what I have to say back is, you're only talking about the income tax. You're not taking account of the payroll tax. If you look at total federal taxes, They're moderately progressive, but actually getting less and less so. Which brings us to state and local taxes. Now, I don't expect you to get excited about state and local taxes. I am. Are you excited about state and local taxes? You should be. You should be. Of course you're excited. Well, let's go to the next slide. What share of total government tax revenues? We're talking about total tax revenues for the whole government. It comes from state and local. A, 10, B, 20, C, 30, D, 40, E, 50. Go. Well, you sort of, there's sort of, it looks like 34% of you think it's C. That seems to be where you're mainly centering. But actually, it's E. Or to be completely accurate about it, 48% of all government revenue, all the revenue collected by government, 48% goes to state and local governments. So we need to understand progressivity and regressivity at the state and local governments if we're understanding who pays what. So here's federal direct revenue, 52%. This is fiscal year 2019. It's actually a little bit, it's almost exactly the same. This is state direct revenue collected, and there's local revenue. So state and local is very important. And then let's go to the next slide. The shift towards state and local tax revenues. Now here's 1900. Here's where we are now. And what you can see is the federal tax revenue, total direct revenue from federal taxes as a percentage of the GDP, percentage of the total economy, has maintained itself pretty much, but state and local have gone up. State and local become more important in terms of the share of the total economy. So which do you prefer as a source of state funding? Do you prefer income taxes, A, or B, sales taxes, taxes on alcohol and cigarettes, lottery and gambling revenues, and user fees like tolls? Go. You got to make your decision. So 49% of you prefer an income tax, and 50% of you, 50 must be 51% of you, prefer these taxes on sales, alcohol, cigarettes, blah, blah, blah. Well, let me just say, most Americans agree with you. That is 51% of you. But I want to point out to you that B, these taxes are regressive because they take a bigger bite out of lower incomes than they do higher incomes. Do you understand why? I mean, it's psychologically interesting. Most people do. They say to themselves, well, I prefer sales taxes and alcohol and cigarettes and lottery and gambling because those are all voluntary. I don't have to do those. I don't have to do any of them. They're voluntary. I don't like income taxes because government takes from me. But the reality is, well, sales tax, you have to buy food, you have to buy gasoline, you've got to buy a lot of stuff. It's not so voluntary. Maybe you can avoid a lottery. A lottery is about the most regressive system you can imagine. I mean, the people who actually are gambling in a lottery tend to be among the poorest people in a state. And alcohol and cigarette taxes also are very regressive because, as we'll see, a lot of people who buy a lot of alcohol and a lot of cigarettes tend to be on the lower income side of the spectrum, but the sales tax is the biggie. Sales tax is the huge one. And so what you want to do is find out in a state how much of state revenue comes from sales taxes and how much comes from income taxes, assuming that the income tax is progressive. Now, that's a big assumption. Maybe it isn't, but it is in most states. But if it comes from a sales tax, it's hugely regressive. Well, let's see. State income taxes, top marginal tax rates as of January 2020. Well, we can see across America where you have the biggest income taxes, not surprisingly, New York, 10.9% income tax. California beats everybody, 13.3% income tax. But what about Texas? No income tax. What about Florida? No income tax. South Dakota, Wyoming, Nevada, no income tax. What about Tennessee? I had lunch yesterday with somebody who I really didn't know. I had to meet with him about some project that turned out I was not interested in helping him. But he told me during the course of the lunch, I asked him where he was from. He said, I'm from Southern California. I said, great, you like it? He said, no, I'm moving to Tennessee. I said, why are you moving to Tennessee? I have nothing against Tennessee. Dolly Parton is in Tennessee. But he said, I'm moving to Tennessee because it has no income tax. A couple of years ago, a guy named Arthur Laffer. Anybody remember Arthur Laffer? Arthur Laffer came up with the Laffer curve, which convinced Ronald Reagan that supply-side economics actually worked. That if you take taxes down on the rich, they will work harder and generate more tax revenue, and that will actually pay for itself. But Arthur Laffer, turns out, I do know, and he's a friend of mine. I like Arthur Laffer, even though we don't agree on anything. And Arthur Laffer, a couple of years ago, we were somewhere together, and he said he was in California. He lived in Southern California, but he said, I'm leaving. Why are you leaving, Arthur? He said, taxes are killing me. Killing me. I said, do you like California? Yes. Do you enjoy living in California? Yes. Well, where are you moving? Texas. You're going to like Texas? He said, yes, no taxes. Well, let's take a look at total state and local taxes as share of family income. But what I want you to pay attention to is this state. I mentioned Texas and Florida, South Dakota, but this is what happens when you have a very, 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 well, we'll take a look at why Washington state ranks first in terms of effective tax rates on lowest and middle income. Just bear in mind. Or maybe you know the answer already. Do you know? State of Washington? Anybody here from the state of Washington? Do you know anybody from the state of Washington? Do you know why? So, Amazon? The CEO of Amazon? Oh, I see. But that doesn't explain why why Washington, the state of Washington has such a regressive tax system. Regressive. Regressive. Regressive, regressive, regressive. It's a progressive, politically progressive state. Well, the answer is because it has a huge sales tax. Washington state has a gigantic sales tax. Not an income tax. I mean, it has an income tax, but it relies much more on a sales tax for state revenues, for all the things that the state does. That's regressive. And as we talked about already, what happens? This is sort of Robin Hood in reverse, because you see, when you add in state and local taxes, what happens to income? Well, you can see that the income in the bottom, second, middle, and fourth quintile, these income groups, when you add in state and local taxes, because state and local taxes are so regressive, they do worse than they otherwise would. So what I want you to do is have a picture in your head at the federal level of payroll taxes being regressive and increasing in terms of their total share of the national economy, certainly. And at the state and local level, state and local becoming more and more important in terms of tax revenue and government services, obviously, but state and local being regressive in the sense that much of it depends on sales taxes and sin tax, the so-called sin taxes, and lotteries. Which gets us to wealth taxes. Now, this is sort of a difficult conversation to have because so many people hate the idea of a tax on wealth. And I'm going to try to demythologize, demysticize, is that the right word? What the issues are, because the issues are complicated. Next slide, please. Now, just to review it, the richest 0.1% have the following wealth share, and we're going to. This is the suspension bridge again. Starting in the mid-70s, late 70s, we again see this, and by now you should have a pretty good idea of why. We see more and more wealth at the top, and the examples of wealth taxes we have. Property tax, I mean, that's a wealth tax. Some people said, no, you can't have a wealth tax, it's unconstitutional. Well, I say back, hello, a property tax is a wealth tax. It's a tax on one of the most important forms of wealth, particularly for lower income people who can afford to have a house. And federal estate tax is probably the most important form of tax on wealth. But the estate tax, as we'll see in a moment, is disappearing. And then there's something called a capital gains tax. Now, I know we are together Friday afternoon. This is our first class together in person. I know that, and you have your masks on, and it's sort of, and we're talking about taxes, and you're thinking about your weekend, and your weekend is coming up, and it's going to be a great weekend. It is going to be a terrific weekend for you. I have inside information. But before we get there, I want you to know how important the stuff we're talking about today really is. This is where wealth and poverty are not determined, but this is a major area that people don't understand, and you need to understand it if you want to understand all of this. So the estate tax. I mentioned before that the estate tax, it was called a death tax politically last time around. Well, it does happen when people die. Yes, that's when estates actually happen. At what size does it kick in? For 2020, $11,058,000 per individual, $22,116,000 for a married couple. Rises with inflation. Now, you're not talking about many people who get to that level. Now, all of the people affected by this tax die, but we are all going to die. The number of people who are affected who get to that, well, it's taxed at 40%, but you have almost nobody. Next slide, please. 1,800 people in the United States end up, actually families, end up owing estate taxes. 1,800. Do you know how small a number of people we're talking about? It almost has ceased to exist. Number of estates facing estate taxes, taxable estates in thousands, starting, and we're just starting in 2001, going through 2025. Take a look. Infinitesimally small. which gets to my favorite topic. Of all the topics we are talking about today, no, there's one that I actually like just as much. Now, one proposal that Biden and the Democrats made that was being considered, is still being considered, made it through the House, it's being held up in the Senate, is the following. Now pay close attention because you need to understand this. When wealthy people, or people with a lot of assets, and the assets are either in the stock market or their bonds or their homes or mansions or their works of art or whatever the assets are, when wealthy people who have these collections of assets die, their heirs do not have to pay taxes on the increase in value of these assets during the lives of the people who have given these assets to them. There's something normally called a capital gains tax. So normally, if I buy some shares of stock and then the stock goes up and I sell those shares of stock, I've got to pay taxes on the capital gain. That is just about the most important wealth tax we have. Or if I buy a house and the house goes up in value, I have to pay capital gains taxes on the increase in value. Or I own a business and the business increases in value. I've got to pay capital gains tax. I've got to pay taxes on the gain in the value of the capital. But if I wait till I die, I don't care anymore. Well, that's sort of a philosophical point. But if I wait till I die and I pass all of these assets on to my children, let's say, the children don't any longer have to worry about any of those capital gains. The basis, that's a technical term, for calculating the capital gains rises to the market value when the death occurs. That's called the stepped-up basis at death rule. It's one of the most important ways in which families pass on huge amounts of wealth and continue to pass on wealth, often generation after generation. This is how dynasties are created. In 1994, I guess it was, Bill Clinton was looking for revenue, and I was sitting with Lloyd Bentsen, who was then Secretary of the Treasury, and he was from Texas. He had been chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, a very distinguished man, very tall, too tall, unpleasantly tall. And I said to him, I said, Lloyd, why don't we get rid of the stepped-up basis at death rule? In other words, why don't we change the tax code so that heirs have to pay capital gains? And he looked at me, I will never forget the horror on his face. He looked at me like I had just suggested that America turn communist. He was appalled that I would even suggest something as radical as getting rid of the stepped-up basis at death rule. Well, it turns out Joe Biden recommended it, and Democrats in the House approved, and it's now in the Senate. And if more Americans understood it, maybe not. there might be more political interest in it. It means huge amounts of money for the Treasury and for the United States. And that means, and we'll get into this in a future discussion, that means a lot of ability, capacity to do a lot of things in addition to national defense, such as, for example, the refundable child tax credit, which we will also get into. Do you know, we just had a huge experiment in the United States. Not many people know it, but between last December, and this past July, we had an experiment in which 65% of American families received from the government $3,000 per child for young children. For slightly older children, $3,600 per child. It was called the Refundable Expanded Child Tax Credit, and it phased out at an income level of about $110,000, which means that a lot of lower income people, a lot of working class people, in fact, a majority of Americans actually got the benefit. And we now know what happened during that interval of time. Child poverty in the United States dropped 33%. I don't know of an experiment we've ever done in this country as dramatic, with as much of an impact that was measurable. And we also know what happened when the child tax credit ended. Child poverty went back up. This is what social scientists consider almost a perfect experiment. And the reason I bring it up is because the Biden administration wanted to continue it. This was also in, what was it called, Build Back Better? And it is still possible, and it is still possible that it could be bipartisan. Mitt Romney, who I almost had a chance to run against for governor of Massachusetts, I would have won. Senator Mitt Romney, who then was from Massachusetts, is now from Utah. Senator Mitt Romney from Utah, Republican, came up with a plan that I think in many ways was better than the extended refundable child tax credit. So there is some room for bipartisanship here. But the point is that if we had a stepped-up basis, if we got rid of the stepped-up basis of death rule, there would be so much money for things like an extended child tax credit. We are talking, friends, about real people, real issues right now. These look like charts and looks like numbers. They are charts, they are numbers. But bear in mind, behind these charts and behind these numbers are lives, real human beings. Unrealized capital gains are not taxed at death, so heirs inherit tax-free, stepped-up basis at death. Here are the unrealized capital gains. Over half the value of the biggest estates come from unrealized capital gains, and they have not been taxed. Over the next 30 years, there's going to be an intergenerational transfer of wealth from wealthy baby boomers to their heirs that is the largest projected transfer of wealth in the history of this country, even adjusting for inflation. Partly because there is no stepped-up basis, because there is a stepped-up basis of death. Sorry. This man, Warren Buffett, he's a lovely man in person. Anybody know Warren Buffett? His granddaughter lives in Berkeley. Do you know her? No? And she's an artist, and she told me that her grandfather gave her money to attend college, and for which she's very grateful. But he hasn't given her a penny since. He's a skinflint. And I thought that was admirable. I thought, she was complaining, but I thought, Warren Buffett I think he still is, the third richest person in the United States. And I thought, pretty good. He's not giving his granddaughter a big windfall. I mean, she's got to make it on herself, on her own. Not bad. But anyway, Warren Buffett is quite influential, and a few years ago, he proposed what he called a Buffett rule. He said, essentially, the wealthy should contribute no less than 30% of their income. That is, with all the deductions, all the tax credits, all of the everything else going on, it should be at least 30% of their income, no questions asked. What did he say? Let's hear him.
My total taxes paid, payroll taxes plus income tax. Mine came to 17.7%. The average for the office was 32.9%. There wasn't anybody in the office, from the receptionist on up, that paid as low a tax rate. The taxation system has tilted toward the rich and away from the middle class in the last 10 years. It's dramatic, and I don't think it's appreciated.
What's the effective rate I've been paying? Well, it's really closer to the 15% rate than anything.
Mr. Romney's income taxes were finally posted, and he paid 13.9%. Nancy and I paid 33% or more, it was in the 30s, and I find that atrocious.
Okay, let's see what would happen to Warren Buffett if the Warren Buffett rule were applied. Well, his net worth was $60 billion. I think it's much higher now. But let's assume that it's $60 billion. And it grew last year by $3 billion. So his reported income last year was $10 million, and from the sale of shares in his company. That's his income. Remember, wealth and income, very different. But you can get income off of your wealth. So that's his reported income last year. So taxes under the Buffett rule, he would pay $3 million. Now that's $3 million. His net worth is $60 billion. You know how many zeros are between 60 billion and 3 million? 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. A lot of zeros. So this is not a big deal for Warren Buffett. Typical American household, for example, let's see. During the recession, many people lost the value of their homes. That was the 2008 recession. And then they did better and better and better. So household wealth, this is the typical household. The typical household wealth grew during this period of time between 2008 and 2018. This is all obviously pre-pandemic. Grew to $89,000. This is a typical household's wealth, pre-pandemic. And their total taxes paid went up correspondingly. Let's look at Jeff Bezos. Total taxes paid and his wealth, it's much bigger now. But why is his tax so much less? Well, there is an answer. If you have a huge amount of wealth, you can go to a bank and you can say, I would like a loan to pay all of my living expenses, and I'd like you to give me a very low interest loan. because I'm not a big credit risk. I'll put up as collateral my 70 billion, which means I have zero risk. And so my actual living expenses, the cost of actually living, can be quite low after I've deducted all of my business expenses. My wealth is not touched at all. Which gets us to the notion of a wealth tax. And here, well, Elizabeth Warren, you remember in the last election, she wanted a 2% tax on net worth above 50 million and 3% above 1 billion. And going back to what we talked about in terms of marginal taxes, people got very confused. They thought this was going to be a tax on me? No, tax on dollars above that. And let's look at the other, this is where Larry Summers comes in. And Larry Summers said, if America had more figures like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Steve Jobs over the last generation, it would have been a good thing associated with a stronger economy, even measured inequality increased, even if measured inequality increased. Bill Clinton was right when he said that he wanted to see an economy with more millionaires, because that meant an economy with more job-creating, successful businesses. Well, there is the argument in a nutshell on the other side. So what do you think of Warren's wealth proposal? A, I'm in favor. B, I oppose. Go. And by the way, I certainly will never know who voted which way, but the CIA does know. Okay, let's see what you have decided. Well, there are 82% of you are in favor and 18% of you are opposed. And if we had time, I would love to talk with those of you who are in favor and those of you who are opposed and maybe get a little debate going. We don't have quite the time today, but that's what I will do in the future, and particularly when masks come off and we all feel more comfortable together, we'll have a little bit more. But I want to, the corporate tax. Talk about mythologies. There is a lot of mythology around this. While payroll taxes grow a growing share of the GDP, corporate taxes are a shrinking share. We already went over this, but let's see it again. Taxes on wages have increased as corporate taxes have decreased over time. This is from 1950 to, actually, the trend has become even more pronounced in recent years. Next. As we've already seen, corporate profits have soared. And we've seen this, but you might just want to take a look. This is corporate profits. And corporate profits have gone down a little bit in 2020, but they're back up. Well, let's also take a look at government. The share of government revenue from corporate taxes has plummeted. We talked a little bit about this before. So if you look at those charts, you might say to yourself, well, wait a minute. You've got corporations never doing quite as well. They're doing wonderfully well, and the corporate tax rate has plummeted. Next. The official and effective corporate tax rate, well, the official rate had been 35%, but then with the tax cut of December 2017 that went into effect 2018, corporate taxes went down. And the effective rate, after all deductions, credits, and foreign profits and transfer pricing to a lower foreign, well, you just have to understand, next, these are corporations that paid no federal income taxes in 2018. This is the latest data we have. 0. But remember, we have to always be aware of who is actually paying the tax. And this is where the corporate tax gets very confusing. who actually pays most of the corporate tax? Is it A, shareholders, B, corporate executives, or C, consumers, or D, workers? Go. Well, let's see. Most of you, 49%, think it's consumers, and that would be the case if the corporation paid the tax and just passed the increased taxes on to consumers in the form of higher prices. And D, 170 of you, 35%, say workers, which would be the case if the corporation paid the tax and then simply took it out of workers' pay, of what they otherwise would pay the workers. And almost nobody says corporate executives. And 13% of you say A, shareholders. Well, you in this classroom are reflecting the confusion that a lot of people have in trying to figure out who actually pays the corporate income tax. The consensus is that shareholders pay most of it in terms of coming out of corporate profits, which find their way back to the value of shares. But that depends a lot on the industry. It depends on the degree of monopolization in the industry. It depends on bargaining leverage. We don't know. And the fact we don't know is probably the best argument against a corporate income tax. In other words, if you really wanted to have a progressive tax, you don't have a tax where you don't even know who's paying it. If you want a progressive tax, maybe you go to the party up here that you feel is most directly affected not only by the tax, but is in the best position to pay the tax. So maybe you want to replace the corporate income tax with a higher capital gains tax. Maybe you do. We won't do a vote on this. Just keep it in mind. The argument here being that of all the parties, it would be shareholders who would be best positioned or more appropriately positioned to pay the corporate income tax. And so the best way of actually affecting shareholders in terms of the taxes they pay is to raise the capital gains, the difference between what they bought the share for and what they will sell the share for. Next. Okay. Now I want you to really get excited about what I'm about to tell you. Because everything I've told you about up till now pales in significance and excitement relative to tax expenditures. My heart starts racing when I talk about tax expenditures. Really, we only have a few minutes, and I'm appalled because this is fun. It's not just fun. What are tax expenditures? Are they the amount the government spends to collect taxes? Or B, individual spending of refunds they get from paying too much in taxes? Or tax deductions, tax credits, and untaxed employer-provided benefits? Go. Well, most of you, 70%, think it's tax deductions, tax credits, and untaxed employer-provided benefits. You're absolutely right. And these are huge. And they are growing at an extraordinary pace. What you need to internalize is that tax expenditures are another form of government spending. Now, I know it's a little hard to wrap your head around it, but let me explain. If the government basically gave you $1,000, it would be the economic equivalent of saying to you, you're not going to pay the government $1,000. That's all I mean. Tax expenditures are large compared to government spending. And here's the interesting thing. If you look at Social Security, for example, Medicare, Medicaid, non-defense discretionary, defense discretionary, I mean, look at the amount of tax expenditure on individuals and corporations. Huge amounts there in the form of tax credits, deductions, and so forth. Next. And tax expenditures have been growing dramatically. And next. I mean, the interesting thing is if you look at spending, government spending on Medicaid, for example, $412 billion in 2019, and the tax expenditure for employer-provided health care is $173 billion, or look at spending on low-income housing, Section 8 vouchers, $19 billion, but the tax expenditure of mortgage interest deductions. The point I want to make to you, and the most important point of all, is that tax expenditures are regressive. They mostly go to higher income people. Next. The top 1% claim more than 24% of all tax expenditures. And it stands to reason. I mean, who's getting employer-provided health care? Not poor workers. Who's getting the mortgage deduction for mansions, for on the interest paid on their, well, it's wealthy people. Oh, this is the last. Here's the last question. The answer, which gets more government aid? Overwhelmingly, Stanford. I'll see you next week.